Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Welcome, everybody, to the John Cimino Says Boom Show, issue 90. I can't believe we made it, but little gaps there every now and then. I guess there's been gaps between shows, but we're busy. We got stuff going on. First off, Nile, before we get into my boy Steve, what's going down?
Hey everyone, check below. Make sure to click that subscribe button and smash that bell for new notifications. And gentlemen, it's like we're launching season 4 right now. I am pumped. I'm like a barbarian. I am ready to smash through what we've got going on. Gentlemen, what do we have?
With a recurring co-host, right? Is that what's coming on right now? Steve, before we get into the weeds of what we're going to talk about, tell us what's going on. What does Conan mean to you, Steve? And I see you at all these Valhalla events with a lot of stuff, a lot of nipples shown, a lot of tights. Me and Niall have been, we know you're eccentric, and I love the close-ups with the squats. Always in the squat. The fronts and the back is so incredibly visual. Like, I'll just tell you this, though, Steve. Me and my girl, Jessica, have been watching all your episodes, and we have the best time. Just tell us what's going on with Conan and your nipples.
Well, as I've mentioned before, it's really funny, but my actual entry point into comics back in 1983 was actually via a Conan comic, not Fantastic Four, not Thor. It was a Conan comic on the back of a bus, and it was Conan issue 147. So all of this comic persona is, it all goes back to that one issue of Conan. So I never was a massive collector of Conan after that, but I've always had an appreciation, and of course, being a big, huge John Buscema fan and a Roy fan, you're going to come across Conan. So yeah, for me personally, and by the way, I still have that issue. It's in my front room. Okay. It's incredibly important, and for me, when it comes to Conan, as soon as you say Conan, I always think, I know there's some people out there that are going to quibble. They're going to say, well, what about Barry Windsor Smith? To me, Roy Thomas, John Buscema, Conan, boom.
Yes. And Steve, this is where we're incredibly alike. I wasn't a big Conan reader too. The first comic I ever saw rolled up in the back pocket of a guy in front of us in 1978 with my mother. I found out years later was Conan #1. It was Conan, and I couldn't believe it because, first off, why back then would a comic 8 years old be there? But the same thing with me, Steve. I wasn't a big reader, but Conan was the very first comic I ever. I thought it looked like a box of Cracker Jacks, the way the colors were. It blew my mind, but this is something me and you have in common. And what about you now? What does Conan the Barbarian mean to you?
Conan, it's fierce, right? It's girth, it's destruction, like everything that our guest tonight, who's a good friend of ours, by the way, and maybe even John, I think John knows our guest tonight, but
maybe
it's just all encompassing, just leadership, destruction, gore. Like I'm into this, and I was so pumped when I saw this article.
Yeah, testosterone. Testosterone.
Yes.
That's what it. And fascinating enough, how this character came to be, obviously, by this guy in 1930, a Texan living in rural Texas, looking at I remember, if you guys remember, Rusty Burke, the president of the Robert E. Howard estate, said he used to look at the trees and and he would get some of these ideas that would kind of come to him. But hey, neither here nor there. But as much as Robert E. Howard is important to Conan, this guy that we have coming on has returned. And I don't know who he is. I don't know if I want to know who he is. But either way, he is a legend.
Mainstream. Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah. Either way, he's one of the biggest legends ever. My buddy, our friend, and recurring co-host, Mr. Roy Thomas. Maybe.
Uh-oh.
No, Roy, you're muted.
Roy, he's muted. Can you go run? Oh God.
Oh no, Jess.
No,
Jess!
yeah, she's on it. She's on it.
Try now.
Okay,
There
can you-
you go.
Oh, there we go.
We got you now.
okay, I'm recurring. And I've got my own screen, no background, but I got a screen finally, my own screen. I don't have to share it, with whatever anymore.
Wait a second. Let me just say something. Roy's making fun of the background on him, but he's lucky he can even be on camera because he lives in the negative zone, and he's complaining about the background while he's like a fuzzy mist with delays for 20 minutes at his house. So Roy, thank you.
Okay, here I am recurring. All right.
Thank you for being here. Okay.
I
Okay.
think we got a few minutes left after that introduction here.
Bump, bump.
All right, let's get into it. Why Mr. Thomas is here? Because the big news is it's Dynamite that has taken the rights to Conan. Is that right, Roy?
No, Dynamite has Red Sonja. This is the company that owns it is Heroic Signatures, which grew out, I guess, of Conan properties, and they do it through Titan Comics. It's sort of Titan Comics is kind of the licensor from Heroic Signatures now.
Right. And now, Roy, just so just to reiterate, I know that they got you to do Conan, Savage Sword of Conan. We'll talk about that issue. But did they have you do something prior to that?
Who? Heroic and Titan? Yeah. No, I'd written the introduction to when they came out with Savage Sword again. I wrote some little one-page introduction. No, the only story I've written for them is this 48-page story that's in there. I guess it's volume 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, how you want to count it. Savage Sword of Conan #7, and I'm doing another one, but this is the only one that's out. But it was a nice 48-page story. It's nice. I didn't that often get a chance to write something that long in a single issue, and it turned out, really, really well. I was really, really pleased with it.
Yeah. What was the importance of that story? I remember it was kind of something from. Was there something from way back that it connected?
No, it's just, I've written so many Conan stories that I sort of, nowadays, I mostly want to feel that I'm doing something that's if I'm making up a story, I sort of want to tie it into something else or something, because my God, I've written hundreds of Conan stories. Other people have written hundreds of Conan stories. And, you could make up another story, but I like to kind of tie it in and have a starting point. And what happened is that way back in issue, I don't know, it was number 20 something. I mean, it was just about 5 or 6 issues after, after John Cimino came aboard. I did this story based on a Robert E. Howard non-Conan story that I turned into a Conan story, and it had at the end, Conan, he's killed this carnivorous giant golden gorilla, because that's what he does, and he carries off this girl. And the thing is, I remember L. Sprague de Camp and his various introductions when he was introducing the Conan stories and writing his past stages. He would always mention the fact that it was so funny that Conan would end up with some girl that they were hot for each other at the end. They might be making out or whatever. Once in a while, they were, kind of sparring partners like Yasmina and the people of the Black Circle. And then the next story, because he wasn't writing them in any kind of chronological order, and they didn't come out in chronological order, The girl was nowhere in sight and never mentioned again. You know, Valeria is in one story, she's never mentioned again. Yasmin is in one story. He never repeated any of the characters. And he would always say, what in the world happened to all these women? Well, I felt that was one of the little things that I missed at that time. I have him carry off this girl saying that he'll take care of her, you know, see to her eventually. And the next thing you know, you pop up and he's in Agrapur, the capital of Turan, which is like, you know, hundreds of miles away from where he was a month or two ago. And I always thought, you know, I should have really done a story that's, I think Helga or Helgi was her name. And I said, something should have, you know, been said about what happened. It'd be kind of nice to tell that story. So when they asked me to do another story, I thought that would be the starting point. I'll tell some story that took place in between those two stories. So it's fairly early in Conan's career. It's just a little while after that War of the Terrim, you know, which Barry Smith and I started, and then John Cimino finished the last couple of issues. It's only slightly after that. And then I just, you know, made up a story that would kind of fit in there, but it just got my juices going, I guess, to do it that way.
Yeah, that's it. Go ahead, Steve.
You know, it's funny. As I've mentioned before, I never actually collected Conan. All of my Conan memories are via work, where I have, you know, and I think it was probably like 18 years ago now that we got a collection in, and the guy had Conan 1 through 275.
Wow.
And, you know, it was my job to go through, you know, grade and price. And, you know, I would flick through and look at the, you know, the characters and stuff like that. But for me, I know in many ways, you know, sacrilege. But for me, as soon as we get to issue 25 and we see John Buscema, I was like, oh my word, you know. Although I must admit, I did like the. I still think it's one of the craziest stories. I don't even know how Robert even thought of it. The story with the giant elephant god inside the little beat. You know, I was just like, what in the hell is going on? You know, you'd think he was on LSD or something. But for me, and again, and Nile mentioned it on the thing, what I really enjoy about Conan, and specifically Roy's version of Conan, which, you know, once you go through issue 1 through 275, you know, you can see all the writing. And then, of course, you know, Roy didn't write it all. Then there was other writers on there. But for me, it's the visceral action. It's the lore. It's, you know, in a way, you know, when you speak to a Lord of the Rings fan and they are 100% into who, what, why, and when. So I think if you're going to work on Conan, you better know the name of the cities. You better know the name of the gods, the deities. Okay. You have got to be on point. And that's why I think having Roy as a voice who was there at the beginning, still working and producing and creating a brand new Conan story, and then wedging it in with other stories that he's done before is, I mean, that's 1 in a million. This is like saying, oh, Stan's still here and he's doing a Fantastic Four story, you know? Or, you know, wait a minute, you know, Broom's doing a Flash story. But well, those guys have passed on, but we still have Roy. And when we still have Roy's particular singular voice, which, in my humble opinion, is the Conan voice. I'm sorry. I know some people might get all upset about that, but for me, if I open up a Conan story, it just has to be that way. If I see Roy's name on it, I'm like, that's original Conan.
Well, I wouldn't even begin to run down the other people who wrote Conan. There were some very good writers. One of the only things that I thought after I left was that they up to that point, that first 110 or so issues, I guess I wrote about 150 or so out of the 275 of the color series, and about the same percentage of the black and white Savage Swords. Up until the time I left, I was really going along, you know, in order, and you could sort of see the story developing based on the way Howard was. I was actually, although I'd have had to drop this in a little bit, I was actually more or less letting a year pass for every year of the comic, which of course was not couldn't last too long, and I would have had to abandon that. And what happened later was when I went back there, I said, well, the stories, there are a lot of good stories, a couple of good villain characters, one or two I used, and so forth, and certainly some very nice art by several other, Gary Capuis, however you pronounce that, and several other people, did some really nice work, and some good writing too. I didn't read the stories that carefully usually, but the thing that got me was that it seemed like they lost the one thing that was kind of lost was the roadmap of Conan's life. It's just like after a while, he just seemed to be wandering around, he was always wandering around, but I was sort of following Howard's life. Once it got dead, he's like he's retracing his steps every couple of issues. In fact, in one story, I forget where, but somewhere in the last couple of years or so before I came on, somebody had some story with some port, but it was actually a landlocked country, on all the maps of Howard, and they had it like it's a seaport, and so forth. And it got a little careless. Most of the writers were better than that. There's some nice, turns of phrases. So my friend Jean-Marc Lofficier, who liked the work, wrote a lot of comics himself, and of course he was partnered with Mobius and was responsible for Mobius's work being published by Marvel a few decades ago. I was wondering how to pick it up. I said, I'm going to be picking it up. It's been like 50 or so issues or so now. And I said, and how do I, get back into it? Because it's like it's just been wandering around. Is he 40? Is he 30? What is this, And Jean-Marc said to me, he says, well, it says if I was, he came out of this cave at the end of the last issue that I did, where he saves Red Sonja and so forth. And he says, I would just have him come out and say, it just seems like it's all been a bad dream for the last couple of years. And that's basically what I did in the first 2 or 3 pages. And I had him say, well, since I walked out of, what was that guy? It was named after a character in a Howard poem. And anyway, I said, since I walked out of this cave, it says it's been like my whole life has been a waking dream and so forth. And I told the editor, I says, I'm going to ignore everything that happened in the last 50 issues unless I want it, and unless I want to count it. It does, it's not like I'm going to say it didn't happen. I'm just going to ignore it. I don't want any reference to any of this. Actually, I used a couple, they had that Devourer of Souls and that 1 or 2 other villains that I used and some other stuff. It's not like I was saying this wasn't good. I just felt like, well, I'm the one that brought Conan to Marvel. I wrote more of it than anybody else. I felt like, with great responsibility must come great power. That's my feeling. So I just felt, and it worked out pretty well and everything. And so that's, but now I sort of like to fill in the stories. Like the last story I had written for Marvel was a 10-pager, and it was like what happened exactly right before Conan #1, the last panel or so. And the Steve McNiven who drew it really had the feel of what Barry was doing, except more polished than Barry was when he started #1, and it that worked out really nicely and so forth. And in the Savage Sword story now with the 48-pager, I was lucky that the artists that I got to work with, Roberto De La Torre, is it Torre? I guess Torre. It's Spanish, so I guess that you would be pronounced, and it's really, he's like a sort of almost a darker film noir version of John Buscema. He's influenced by Buscema and he draws like him, and yet I think some of it's kind of coincidence, sort of like when everybody thought Mike Klug, was imitating Eisner, and it turned out Mike Klug drew like that before he ever even met Will Eisner, and everything. And this guy, I guess, was sort of in that vein. But now working with him was a lot like working with John Buscema again, and except with even moodier blacks, because John didn't like to ink his own work, and De La Torre does just a marvelous job. So when they asked me to do another one, and I said, well, I didn't really have time to plot a story right now. I'm working on finishing up my autobiography, and I didn't want to be distracted for 2 or 3 months with having to do a story for 48 pages. I just didn't have time for it. So Roberto had a story he was thinking about doing. It was as a 10 or 20 page thing sometime. And I said, well, why don't you just take that, and fool around with it, expand it, says, whatever you do, I'll write it. You'll get he gets the money for the plot. He gets the credit for the plot. I'm just going to be the dialoguer of the next one. In 2, 3, 4 months, I'm just going to pick it up, and then I'm going to just see this whole story and write it. I didn't really usually work that way. I mean, Stan, I know, worked that way with Ditko, and to some extent later with Kirby, but I didn't generally do this. I mean, the closest I came was guys like Neil Adams, would do a lot of plotting, and after we talked the story, and I didn't know what the hell he was going to turn in, but I always liked it, so it didn't matter. And so I'm just very happy that Roberta would just give me the story, and then I'll write it. I'm certain that I'll be delighted with it. I hope that the readers will be too. And then maybe if I have time, maybe I can, I have one or two areas that I particularly want to do, but I don't think they'll let me do them. So I can't entirely blame them, because I want to write about old Conan, being 84, going on 85 myself. I don't want to write about an 80-year-old Conan, but I want to write about, what happened to him after he left being king. He sailed off to the West,
Yeah.
I've always, and I did one or two things like this at the end of the Marvel run, but I never got a chance to really get into it. I wanted to have him just like he discovers the sort of the Western Hemisphere equivalent of the Hyborian Age. But just like the Hyborian Age is like the equivalent of Europe and Asia and Africa, and you've got these names that sort of echo. I want to see him go to places, and it's a combination of like the more primitive Native American type of civilizations, but not quite,
Yeah.
And at the same
That
time,
seems,
there'd be things that would echo the Incas, the Aztecs, or whatever hell else I could think of, any legend I could come up with. And I would just, if I could have my druthers do anything, I would just do some monthly or bi-monthly book, and just have Conan stumbling around a whole new world at the age of about 50 or 60, whatever he is.
Mm-hmm.
But what I don't understand is who has the power to basically say, oh, I don't agree with Roy Thomas's creative vision for this character, and then veto it?
Well, every editor does. I mean, ever since the only time I had the power to really control the destiny without answering to anybody, except Stan, who didn't know what was going on anyway, was and didn't want to know, was that first 10 years, from 1 to 110 or 15, whatever it was, the last one. When I came back, I was never the editor, but I had a good relationship with my editors, and only 2 or 3 arguments, with a couple of on this and that, but basically they sort of let me alone and everything, and we got along very well. And the people I'm working with at Heroic / Titan, I'm very happy with them. They may just not want to deal with the idea of also, they only have 1 or 2 Conan things. They may not want them to be a 60-year-old Conan, and so forth, or to obligate themselves to somebody like me who's liable to drop off the face of the earth at any time or something.
Well, I don't know about Nile and John, but I think it's rather odd that if you're coming to the table with a brand new idea about having some continuity of Conan's life, which to my memory hasn't been done before, wouldn't it behoove an editor or an assistant editor or whoever to say, wow, this is Roy Thomas and he wants to do an idea. It's not like, well, I had a job. I was a barista at Starbucks, and I think I have more knowledge and I know the market better than Roy Thomas, so I don't think we should publish this.
Well,
I don't know. That just seems a little bit odd to me. What about you guys? Does it seem odd to you?
Oh,
A little bit.
That seems to be the big thing. I mean, first off, I think that actually sounds really good to have Conan going in that whole new, you get whole new ventures, and it's fresh. And it's all fresh and all that stuff. It's something that, you don't really see Conan. And having Roy do it, that gives it authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, if I went there and pitched it and said, oh, I've got an idea for Conan, by all means, throw me out. Who in the hell am I? I've never done it before. But when Roy says, hey, I have an idea and I'm passionate about this, something that I can really put, bite my teeth into, why would you try and dissuade him?
Well, they've only got a couple of books, if they had 4 or 5 Conan books, but they've got Savage Sword, and that's kind of something where they want a new story kind of every issue, maybe an occasional continual. I can certainly see that that's not the place for that, unless it was a backup feature continuing.
Yeah, I
And,
think it would be a great
it
idea.
would almost have to be a new title if they ever wanted to invite. Actually, the old saying about be careful what you wish for. If I did this, I'd have to give up. If I really started doing a monthly book again, I'd probably have to give up Alter Ego, which I don't particularly want to do. I've only done 200 issues. I must have a couple left in me here, and and then I'd really be obligated to be doing all this plotting and all the research. See, when I was working on the most heavily researched, besides Conan, that was research, but I was just reading the fiction stories. The most heavily researched sword and sorcery I ever really had to do was the Arak, Son of Thunder, because that was set in the 8th, 9th century. But there, my wife Dan, she sort of took over that thing. She did a lot of research. I mean, I sort of knew a little about the history, but she had come up with the general idea anyway, so she enjoyed looking it up, and we just took him on a voyage, sort of around the world. We had him start off in Frankland, and then go to Rome, and then to the Arabian Peninsula, and he ended up in Japan by the end of 40 or 50 issues. And I'd have to suddenly be doing all this research in history, which would be kind of fun. So it'd be a challenge, and maybe I'd like it, maybe I wouldn't.
I think it would be awesome, Roy.
But,
And the thing is, you're so accurate.
I have to say, I haven't pushed this on him real hard. I mentioned it in passing at one time, in some letter some time ago, and I'd love to do something like this, but it's not like I've been coming on real, strong wanting to do it. And besides, they've got they've got one or two regular writers that are doing it. If they added another book and they wanted me to do it,
I think probably the way the project sounds to me is if it would be a good special or annual, something that's off on its own.
Well,
you do your single story. It's not like you're going to be doing a monthly book, but it would be something that you could either do 48 pages or even 68 pages, and really get it out of your system.
That's the trouble. I have a whole different orientation toward comics in general, not just with Conan, but I've never been. I mean, I guess I've done some decent standalone comics here and there, but at the same time, I've never been a person who thinks in terms of I want to come on, I want to do one special issue or something like this, make a big splash with or even a 2 or 3 part story or a little miniseries. That happened with not with Marvel, but it did the second time around, but not the first or second, but about the third. But if the thing is, if I get a series, even a 12-issue series, like I had for Dark Horse, or I had a 6-issue series or whatever for Marvel, by the time I start, it takes me a while to get warmed up to something, especially when I haven't done a character for several years. Like with Conan, you don't do a character for several years. You've kind of forgotten all the details. You take a few issues to kind of get into it, and then it's over. See, so if I knew that a story was going to be maybe 12, but if I knew something was going to be 6 issues or 3 or 4, it's a big yawn to me. That's just me. I really have a lot of trouble getting it up for that. I've always been oriented since the day I walked into comics in 1965, and and certainly soon after that when I took over books like X-Men or Avengers. I've always been oriented toward longevity. If I like something, I mean, okay, so Millie the Model, I wanted to get out of, but X-Men, I wrote that for a year or so. Avengers, I wrote 70 issues in a row plus a few annuals. Conan, I wrote 100 and something issues. Even books I'm not that carefully associated with, like Daredevil and things, I'd write for a year or two, and everything, and until something came along. And the books I really liked, like Avengers, All-Star Squadron at DC, Conan, those were books that I wrote. Even Doctor Strange the second time around, I'd write for a year or two or whenever. That's my orientation. My idols in this, my images there are Stan Lee and Jack Kirby doing 100 and something issue, 101 or 102 issues of Fantastic Four, or Stan doing 100 issues of Spider-Man, and he wouldn't have left if he hadn't had a movie script to write. He'd have still been doing it for another year or two until he finally, became publisher. That's just my orientation. I just like to get into something and really get into it and screw everything else and just concentrate on that one thing.
So how do you take, Roy, if you don't mind me asking, how do you take that concept of longevity, and then you go into Savage Sword of Conan, where now we're bringing back someone who's been prolific in Conan? I mean, you brought Conan to a level where it was like a novel, right? It was like a sci-fi novel people read and
You
they
know,
got
I don't know
into
how
it.
good it
And
was a novel. I don't
yeah,
know.
right. It was a novel, but you brought it to a world of imagination where you had visuals, you had great scripts. I mean, I love what you did on the original Conan series and everything. But how do you take that longevity? How do you take that persona of what you just said of like, well, you need longevity and I like having
Mm.
this and that. And then you go and someone says, "Hey, join in this. Join into the series at, let's say, issue 7," right? How do you take that and how do you make it your own?
Well, like for one thing, with no disrespect to the other writers, you know, I mean, I glanced at the other stories and so forth, but since I was doing this with my own continuity, I really didn't pay much attention to what had been done because there is no continuity. So therefore,
Yeah.
you know, the only continuity I felt was I was doing it between two issues that I had written, what, how many years ago? 50 years ago?
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
I,
Yeah.
I was coming back and doing just
Wow.
putting something into continuity, a continuity implant, a term I always hated, you know, retroactive continuity in a way, a term that some people said I invented, although I don't think I did. But anyway, and you know, so it was fairly easy. If somebody had said try to make it work with what these other guys did, even though there's some, you know, they're good writing. What's the name of the main guy that writes it? That writes a lot of the stuff, has that short name, does a good job of it. The Conan at
Yeah.
there. Anyway, I was prejudiced against him first because I read the first story, and in the middle of one fight, he suddenly says he's working for somebody, and he says, "Well, then consider this my resignation." And I felt like that's really not Conan, that he wouldn't say. But the rest of the story it was just that one word. And I've written worse lines than that, you know, for Conan, especially in the early days and so forth. And that was, you know, he's in the early days too. And the rest, and when I looked at the rest of the story, it was fine. There was just this one line that bugged me because I saw the word resignation. And I said, that didn't seem quite right for Conan. But I look at stuff that I wrote sometimes, and I'll see some line and say, you know, that's not right. That's not what Conan should say. And also, I never wrote Robert E. Howard's Conan exactly anyway. I was always sort of writing a mixture of Robert E. Howard's Conan and whatever I thought, you know, Marvel Comics readers
Yeah.
kind of wanted. It was
Like adapting it to what a
yeah.
comic book reader would like
Mhm.
versus a novel reader.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you know, maybe I could have I could have maybe gotten closer to a little closer to Howard's style and the grimness and things. But remember, we're doing a code approved comic when I start this, and it's 1970. We weren't even sure we could have swords go through people. You remember how John Buscema had this great trick? He'd have Conan stabbing people with swords, and he'd show him from the back, and you'd see that the sword obviously had gone through, but it hadn't quite gone through the cape, so it's kind of sticking out to a point. Because we had Len Darvin of the Comics Code to get this thing through, you know, and you know, I mean, you know, he made us change Conan's stance so that when Belit is wriggling to him on the deck of her ship, right after she's met him, we had to change it so both of Conan's legs were on one side of him because so that she wasn't crawling up between his legs. You know, we had to actually redraw that. You know, and that great what was that thing he also in the line in Robert E. Howard, which I was just quoting, was that she says when she starts this dance, which should really be in the nude, but you know we weren't going to try for that. Yeah. But because she wears way too much clothes in the comics compared to what she actually, you know, was wearing in there. But she says, "See now the mating dance of Belit." You know, and the code said you have to change that. I'm talking to Len Darvin, this lawyer on the phone. We got along pretty well, Len and I. And I said, Len, well, you know, what do you suggest? I haven't got time to be fooling around with this now. And then you reject something else. Have you got any suggestions? He says, yeah, how about the love dance of Belit? I said, well, you know, if you're going to have to change, that's not too bad. Said, but can I ask you why, you know, why the change? You know, what would be your reason for the change? He says, well, you know, love could be anything, but mating is very specific, which I thought was pretty good for our comics. He was pretty good for Comics Code people. He would let us get away with a lot of stuff back then. He wouldn't let them do in the superhero comics because he was convinced that Conan had an older readership than the other comics. on the other hand, we were going for that young readership too, but I'm not going to argue with him. We just took whatever freedom we could get and ran with it. And Barry, of course, was, he got in trouble all the time. I mean, when we tried to reprint Frost Giant's Daughter, we had to redraw panels. And in that Song of Red Sonja, right? And you printed that, John, in your thing there. We actually printed the page, not the page that ran in the color comic, but the page that ran in the Treasury. That was the page, before.
Unedited. The unedited.
Yeah. He's grabbing her tail out of there, and she's nude up, from the waist up, and that's what Barry drew. And I said, well, we're not going to get this through, So we ended up with both versions and getting into print. So it worked out okay.
Yeah, so how did you get the continuity in? How did you get, because like what you did with Conan, first off, I would love to know, like, why Conan, right? Like, you're in a time where Fantastic Four is booming and Spider-Man is booming and all these crazy IPs are booming, and you brought Conan into the mix. But
that was the readers.
The readers wanted.
It wasn't me. It wasn't. Yeah, Stan was the guy who decided to do it. But what really was is we were getting a lot of mail saying, and there were 4 things people wanted us to do. And I sometimes it said Conan, but a lot of times it would say, and it didn't really. Very seldom was it saying make up a sword and sorcery character. It was saying you should license or get one of the sword and sorcery characters from there. Sometimes it said Conan. But a lot of times it was just.
So why Conan? What made you feel in that whole, just in the unison of everything? Like, what made you feel I can work on Conan?
Look, we couldn't get Thongar. Like the name, Lynn Carter had this guy. He was sort of half Conan and half John Carter in a way, a little closer to Conan. Thongar had a great name. And when we're talking about stuff, Stan says, I like that name, Thongar. Conan. See, Conan starts with a C. That's not good.
Yeah.
C is a weak letter. It's not even a real letter. Sometimes it's S and sometimes it's K. Conan, I
take offense to that, Roy. I take offense.
But what got you feeling, all right, we're doing Conan?
Of the 3 names we discussed, at the time, Thongar, Kull, and Conan. Stan liked Conan the least of them because he's basing it all on the name. He's not thinking of the Frazetta covers. He's not thinking of the stories because he never read any of it. So when he heard Thongar, so I said, well, I didn't figure we could get Conan anyway, because that's the top of the thing. That's selling a lot of paperback books, but I knew Lynn Carter slightly because, he lives in New York. I had met him at a couple of conventions, and he loved the idea of having his character in a comic, but his agent, the deal was $150 an issue, no royalties or anything. And while that's more money in 1970 by far than it is now, the fact remains it wasn't exactly a king's ransom. And the agent, Henry Morrison, is going to get 10% of $150, so he just stalled and stalled. And Stan would come back to me after 2 or 3 months and say, how's that sword and sorcery thing? Well, the agent isn't moving. He's waiting for Martin Goodman to raise the price. He did not know Martin Goodman. And that's so finally one day I got just disgusted, not with Lynn, but I read and I bought the new book came out. It was the one called Conan of Samaria, the one with the Frost Giant's daughter in it and that beautiful cover by Frazetta. That was late 69 or something like this. And I bought it. And for the first time, I really paid attention to L. Sprague de Cam's introduction. And at the end, he mentions there's this guy named Glenn Lord who lives in Pasadena, Texas, and he's the literary agent for the Robert E. Howard estate. Well, I didn't need a house to follow me to tell me maybe if I wanted to write to Conan, maybe I should write to not L. Sprague de Camp, but to the guy who's called the agent for the Robert E. Howard estate. So I write him a letter, and I was so embarrassed. I've said this before, but I was so embarrassed at that 150 that I knocked it up to 200. Yeah. And that's why I ended up writing. I was going to have Jerry Conway or somebody write. I had no great interest. I didn't read that stuff that much. I'd read Conan by the time, and I knew that Robert E. Howard was better than Glenn Carter or John Jay.
What a genius, though, he is. He was a genius.
But at the same time, I had no great desire to write it. But if Goodman wanted his money back, that $50, at least I could say I'll write a couple pages for free, and that's how I sort of backed into writing. Without that, I have a doubt if I would have written the comic. At all. It might have done just as well or better under Jerry. Who knows?
But with Conan though, like, you know, there by the time you guys wrote the comic, there was already decades beyond that, right? Like, was there like almost like a just in like an equilibrium of just like inspiration for you? Did you go back to like past novels and something? Because Conan, I mean, if you think about it, right? Like, you guys did the comic series. Then there was multiple like TV series on it. There was movies with Arnold
It's got
Schwarzenegger,
50 tour
which we're
books too.
involved with. But like, there's
Yeah.
so much to it. So it's almost like you played off like, oh, it's Conan. You know, we did whatever. But like, I feel like there's more to it. I think you embodied more of Conan than you're letting on.
Well,
Right?
there wasn't as much of it when we started. There were no movies. All there
Yeah.
was at the time, I mean, way in the background, you've got the original pulp magazines, which nobody, had seen by this point, going back to 1932.
Yeah.
But all you really had at the time, you had about a dozen or so paperback books, half of which is by De Camp and Carter and this guy Bjorn Nyberg in Norway or Sweden or wherever he was. And so half the stuff isn't even by Howard. And and there were no movies, there were no there was no comic strip. There was just the paperback books. A lot of comics fans didn't read paperback books. I mean, some of them did, but a lot of them didn't. So when Conan came out in the comic book, that was almost like his second medium. The main medium was the paperbacks, and then suddenly comic books. So that was pretty well in until 82 when the Conan movie with Schwarzenegger came out. It was just me here and Howard and the other guys over in the paperback books.
And you did more.
Do you feel like you were? To me, it's like, I love Conan. I think Conan is the barbarian.
You got the same hairdo as Conan.
Yes. Yeah, Roy has it. But I feel like the work you did, the work that you maybe it was a business, right? Maybe it was just, hey, this was part of my job. This is what we were doing. We were developing this series. But I feel like you guys really gave Conan the trajectory to
absolutely
go beyond comics, to go
the story was just
would the movie have happened if it wasn't for the comics? Would the series
it wouldn't have happened then
for the comics?
It wouldn't have happened at the time because Lancer Books that published the paperbacks had gone into Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the early 80s. Despite the good sales of Conan, they had other problems, and so I remember if I hadn't already been one of the hugest fans around of Sammy Davis Jr., he had Schwarzenegger on sometime in the late 70s because Schwarzenegger was attached by 75. He was attached to that movie, and he's on there. I don't remember if it was Davis's own show or if he was hosting for Johnny Carson, whichever one it was. Schwarzenegger gets on there, and he says, and so Davis says, "What are you up to?" He says, "This is why I'm going to do a movie about Conan the Barbarian." And Sammy Davis, bless his heart, I don't care. Forget about Bojangles and everything else. He says, "Oh, the comic book character."
Yeah.
Well, that's you. That's you.
And I thought that was great, but not because I feel that Conan was mine. I was just popularizing a character who was so good that all I could do was just try to do a decent comic book version of it. And, I think we did. And I think that, Barry got into it after, took him a couple issues to get into it. I don't think I really cared that much to necessarily stay into it. I could have been talked into leaving anytime. And I think until I adapted, Tower of the Elephant, which was my favorite.
Yeah.
And still is my favorite of all the Conan stories, despite the fact that at some point I think he throws a rope 150 feet into the air, which is probably unlikely even for Conan. But otherwise, it's such a wonderful story. When Stan read that story, by the way, he noticed the fact that Conan has absolutely nothing to do with the outcome of the story. He's just standing around. The elephant god does everything. I guess he kills him. He kills the elephant god, puts him out of his misery. But the elephant god's the real mover. Conan's just a guy, and he's in there, and then he runs out of the tower before it falls down. And that was not Stan's, kind of story. he read that story because it was the first one he ever read. Because he said, show me one sometime when you think it's gotten really good. So I said, well, I'll show the Robert E. Howard story. At least it's not all mine. It'll be as good as it can get. And he took it in for about 5 minutes, came back, kind of tossed it on my desk. It says, well, it's not my kind of thing, but I guess it's all right. And, so I thought it was kind of good because I felt like, it brought me out a little bit. It wasn't intended to, but in some ways it brought me out a little bit from under the shadow of Stan, because everything else I had done, even working with Neil on X-Men and all the other stuff was, still working with Stan's characters and doing sort of the Stan style with my own little innovations. But all of a sudden with Conan, I was a little freer because I was influenced by Stan still in some ways, but I was also influenced by this other writer, and that gave me, I felt, more freedom to to go out on my own to either use phrasing or, for example, I didn't use any thought balloons. Marvel had zillions of thought balloons at the time, and I did too, and I liked them. And I didn't use any non-verbal sound effects. I'd have a growl or whatever, but no. And it was actually the first issue of Kull the Conqueror, which means there's been 5, 6, or 7 issues of Conan by this point. And Stan looks at this thing and says, well, this one scene, there's something, this one scene here where he clashes with this other guy, the second or third page of the parade. He says, why don't we just put a big clang right here? That'll make it look so good. I said, well, I don't use sound effects in the Sword and Sorcery book, Stan. He stared at me like I had just, told him I was, going to seduce his daughter or something like that. It was just beyond his comprehension, And I didn't even bother to. I don't think he ever knew that I didn't use thought balloons. I feel there's no sense bringing that up too, But I just never did because I felt like I didn't feel you really got inside Conan's head that much, the way that maybe you would in Spider-Man's or somebody else's. And they sometimes would tell you what Conan was thinking, but I just felt like if there was the caption gave it a little bit of a remove and so forth. So. But they were just things that I wouldn't have if I had been still following Stan. If I were doing some other book besides Conan, taking it from another medium and another author, maybe I wouldn't have done that. But Conan kind of freed me. So we were good for each other. We were good for Marvel. We were good for Arnold Schwarzenegger. We were good for Barry Smith.
Yeah, but
well, Conan. It's a fun kind of talk because Conan freed me too, because I'm a little younger than John and Steve, right? But comics for me, when I started reading Conan, my barber, back in 1988, would give me comics, and I got Conan comics. And what was fun for me, and I had a hard time reading, but comics helped me learn to read. And long story short, the books I was reading were Conan books that you wrote. And they were
Conan not in 1988. I wasn't writing Conan then.
No. These were back issues. These were back issues back then, right? But the books I was reading,
I was in the bins,
70s, yeah, from the 70s and whatnot, early 80s, whatnot. My barber would just buy them or whatever, but he would give them to me every time I went. He'd cut my hair. He'd say, "Here's more comics for you, blah blah blah." And that's how I got into comics, was actually from my barber. But long story short is I got really into Conan, and I got into Conan. I got into Batman. I got other things. But what Conan did for me was made me realize comics were more than the Fantastic Four. They were more than Spider-Man. They were more than Batman, Superman, whatever. It brought me into a world that was more diverse for me personally. Oh wow, this is so different from Spider-Man or Batman. And I was so into Conan. And then a few years beyond, I got into Hercules. And then, they started doing the Hercules series and stuff. But I got really into the barbarian warrior aspect. But I remember reading your books. And as funny as this sounds, my mom would go through and read the credits to me. Because I would ask her, who is making these books, Mom? I love these. And she would say, writer Roy Thomas, arter so and so, blah blah blah. And what grasped me the most was wow, comic books are more than superheroes. And for you, it's like I'm doing Conan, I'm doing fantasy. We're expanding genres for the comic book industry, bringing more readers in. I'm doing my job. But for a reader, you were expanding the fact that comics could be more than just superheroes. And for a kid in the late
it was kind
80s
of a
and
lead
90s,
in to to Marvel expanding, because over the next couple of years, and again, Stan has as much to do with this as I did and more. Then you suddenly had the kung fu heroes, 2 or 3 of them. You
yeah,
had the monster heroes, 5 million
they
of those.
did, but those
And
stories
I
didn't
think
grasp
Conan was
me
kind of
as
a
much.
lead in to that in some ways. Although they
Yeah.
were maybe in some ways they were closer to superheroes, but they still were expanding. And Conan
And,
showed
and,
that we needed to branch out. You can't just keep doing superheroes forever. You need to
and
find
Nile,
Yeah.
you got Roy and
somebody
Nile.
put
This is the
somebody
other
else in.
thing we
Yeah.
gotta talk on. Like Conan has it inspired you now. Also, Roy, you got to take a little bit of credit for in the 70s, in the mid to late 70s,
I'm
all
a
of a sudden
credit
this
hog, don't you know? Haven't you read these articles? Go ahead.
yeah, no, but I'm just saying the fantasy genre got huge, and then what spawned out of that fantasy? Conan, that was inspired by Conan, was Dungeons and Dragons. That Gary Gygax and all those guys, they were reading the novels and they were reading the comic books. And the
Yeah.
reason why I know this, even in the very first edition, when they were small books, they had this thing called demigods, gods, demigods, and heroes. And this is like 1970, I think 75. Conan's a big hit at the time, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
they have the
That got big.
Iberian age characters. They got Conan in there, they got friggin' Red Sonja. But it's funny. Why would they have those characters? It's because of what Conan was inspiring to the world
Yeah.
at the time. So
And look at what
Dungeons and
happened on
Dragons.
TV. Hercules, the Hercules show with Kevin Sorbo and so forth. That was because he couldn't get the rights to Conan.
Yeah.
Oh,
They couldn't get the rights to Conan,
That's
so
what I
they
was
did
going to go
Hercules.
into with that.
Instead of Xena Warrior Princess, we might
Yeah.
have had a Red Sonja show. If and everything, which I might have preferred in some ways, but
So you come
so it's been
full
kind of an
circle.
influence, but that's me. But but it's also Robert E. Howard. I'm an interpreter, and I did a decent enough job interpreting a really good character. Which, of course, nowadays his time has kind of passed. I mean, a lot of people, he's a sexist, and it's not as sophisticated as Lord of the Rings. I'm not a big Lord of the Rings fan. I got to tell you. I love it. I like that kind of thing. And I read the book. I finished. The last book of the Lord of the Rings,
Tolkien.
the wee small hours of January 1st, 1968, after a particularly dull New Year's Eve party at my apartment. I went back and read it, but I've never had the desire to read it twice. I haven't even seen all the movies, although I love that kind of feel. But I prefer Conan to Lord of the Rings, and that's just a personal choice. Maybe it's because I like heroic fiction, and it's a little bit closer to to Batman and Spider-Man maybe than say,
he's part of that lore. He's that fantasy lore, like Conan, Lord of the Rings, and other IPs that have came out. 100 years ago. But where do we come full circle, right? Like you worked on Conan back in the 70s, made him huge in the 80s. If it wasn't for what you did, we wouldn't have the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, we wouldn't have all these things. But now you come back to Savage Sword of Conan, and they say, "Hey, Roy, we want you to write this issue." Where does it bring you? What emotions? Like is it just a job, or are you like, shit, I want to write?
I was worried, whether it would work out. I mean, I didn't have as much trepidation somehow at Marvel, but here now you have a whole different new company, and it's a 48-page story with an artist. Of course, I hadn't worked with the other artists before either, so it was a little touchy. But somehow, once I got going, with the thing, I liked it. When I read over it, I got to admit, while there's few parts I think I find a little overwriting and a little too much alliteration, perhaps, or a couple of things here and there. But when I got to admit, when I read that story that I wrote, I think it doesn't hold up with the best of Robert E. Howard, but I think it holds up with most of the stories I wrote back in the 70s at Marvel. And considering my advanced age, that I'm,
Well, I think,
I figure,
Roy,
You're timeless.
yeah.
Roy, you're timeless.
again, you seem to be the master of understatement here, because I think what Nile is getting to is your ability for a turn of phrase, your ability for dialogue, your ability to build dialogue within a simple little piece of narrative. That ability does not exist with all writers. And whenever you read anything that you've done, you have this singular ability to like get the hair on people's arms raised because the way you're already explaining something. And the same thing happens if you read your Thor and your Conan. There's a certain pacing, there's a certain way of grandeur, there's a certain way you're introducing certain characters, a certain way that you're building up a villain. Where you'll start talking about this ridiculous golden ape's feet ripping into the ground, and it's like, wow, okay, you're already building it. Now, again, I don't think, and I'm sure that both John and Nile agree here, I don't think another writer, I mean, maybe Jerry could have done it, but generally speaking, I just can't think of another writer being able to take that franchise and flow with it and keep going year after year and make it what it is, which is
we'll never know, will we? Because we ever got a chance, because I wouldn't let them. Once I started writing it, a couple people would want to use Conan in this or that, and I'd say no. And the only thing I ever did, and he did a great job with it, Chris Claremont wanted to do that Red Sonja story where Mary Jane is in Red Sonja's body, and I thought,
yes, yeah, Marvel team up.
That was fantastic.
But I didn't let him use Conan. The funny thing is, I co-created Red Sonja in a way. I mean, it's a Robert E. Howard character, but and yet it isn't. But I never was as interested in writing Red Sonja. I was interested in co-creating her in a way, or developing her and making her a character and so forth. And I'm real proud of that. But I was never that interested in actually writing the comic book. That's why I let my friend Claire, write some of it with me and things like this. I didn't do that with Conan. Nobody ever came in. Even All-Star Squadron, I had a couple of people co-wrote one or two, but Conan, I wrote everything. I mean, I worked on plots with various wives, so from time to time and everything, whatever, or and a couple of people here and there. And of course, I'd love to adapt. Robert E. Howard. I was determined to adapt everything in the world because it was so much work. By this stage, I'm doing 40, 50, 60 pages of Conan every month between two books, eventually three with the first few issues of King Conan. And I just wanted to, so I said, well, I'm going to adapt everything that's there. And when I run out of that, then I'll fall, as Al Williamson used to say, when I'd ask him, what if his autograph machine broke down? He said, I'll fall back on talent, he used to say. And I was prepared to do that. Luckily, about the same time I ran out of what was then the Conan published, the last just about of the El Spring de Camp stories, because the Torre books and those things hadn't really started yet. So when I left Marvel, so I didn't have to worry about what I was going to write. So I don't know what percentage I wrote is based on Howard and not. But I dragged in, everything Howard ever wrote. I dragged in stuff that Lovecraft wrote. I wrote as Clark Ashton Smith, I had John Jakes and various people doing, plots for me, people who knew sword and sorcery just for the heck of it, see what happened. And it was just a lot of fun. And I would just be the puppet master. Right. Anyway, Thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that, there's a few people that still alive that remember that stuff, everything. And they reprinted. I got to admit, one of the best things that ever happened. I wasn't that thrilled when I heard Marvel, 10 years ago or whatever, when they got Conan back and everything for a while. But I didn't care that much because I knew whatever happened, I wasn't going to be asked to write it on a regular basis. I might write an occasional story, but they weren't going to give it to me on a regular basis. I didn't even bother to ask and so forth. They would never have considered it, so I didn't care. But then it turned out they did a wonderful job with the packaging of all the reprints, these gigantic omnibus volumes. So and I made a mint of money out of that. So you know, and enjoyed, just loved seeing them collected that way and so forth. So I'm
Yes.
you know, real happy with that. So, you know,
Yeah.
I feel I'm, you know, kind of lucky. I'm just, the best thing that ever happened to me with regard to that was Lynn Carter's agent deciding to hold out, you know, for that extra, you know, for that extra $100 or so an issue and so forth. And if he had known Martin Goodman better and known that Martin Goodman was never going to raise his offer 1 penny, then he might have changed his mind, and then I'd have been writing Thangor. It would probably been canceled in 10 issues, you know.
Yes.
Conan was a little better character, so I could really wrap myself around Conan in a way I don't think I could have with even with Call, and certainly not with Thangor. So I got lucky too. Howard got lucky. Barry Smith got lucky. Doesn't appreciate it, but he got lucky. You know, the only person didn't need it, John Cimino, was so good he didn't need it, but we're lucky that he did it. You know.
Yeah.
All right. So we're gonna wrap this up. Roy, you got to get out of here. Dan's gonna kill you. And you know, but just wanted to say, like, the influence of Conan. Let's just go around the horn here. Steve, what do you think? The true influence of Conan. Like, what do you think that means to the whole pop culture phenomenon?
I really do think that the work that Roy, and starting off with Barry, and of course on there with John, is the template for the exactly how sword and sorcery should be done. It's a high watermark. It's the template, and it's the work that everything gets compared to.
Absolutely. Nah.
Yeah, no, I agree with Steve. Yeah, I mean, what Conan did and through the 70s and then reprints through the 80s and 90s, I mean, it really brought like comics to beyond superheroes, you know, into that fantasy realm where like you had the barbarian, where you felt like the freaking juggernaut, like the real juggernaut. Now we're not talking X-Men, but we're talking about people that came in and just really bashed it up. And what you did was really cool, man.
Yeah.
Conan's been very, very good to me, to paraphrase old
Yeah.
Saturday Night Live.
But Roy, I think what was great about Conan ultimately was it was such a different comic from everything that was coming out at the time. That was such a radical change in storytelling, and
that's what the readers wanted. As I said, the readers were the ones who were, you know, were the ones that wanted it. It wasn't Stan. I didn't go after it on my own, and Stan wouldn't have gone after it his own because he didn't know what it was, and I wouldn't have bothered. So we're very lucky the readers told us what to do.
Yes, and also from another perspective, and I think you know, John also knows this. If a customer would come into the store and they would sneer at superheroes, "Oh, I don't read stuff like that." Yeah. You say, "Well, have you ever read Conan? He doesn't fly around with a cape. He hasn't got laser beam coming out. He's just got his strength and his sword and his fighting skills."
Anyway, thank you very much, and you know, it's been a pleasure. Yeah. It's always nice to recur once in a while, especially now that I don't end up sounding like, you know, Mickey Mouse like we used to when John and I would be, you know, leaning over the sink, you know, in the bathroom area of the guest.
Right. We should tell people really. We should tell people.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And
we should tell people really quick. This is actually my place. Roy's at. He's in a different room. I'm in a different room.
That's right. I'm at his place, Jay.
Yeah. All right. So, okay.
No
now,
glitches, John. No glitches.
Yeah, no more. And no delays. All right. Thank you, Roy. We love you. Got to get out of here. Niall, get us out of here with, excuse me, Steve, get us out of here with Mighty Mystic. Forget Niall.
Yeah, forget me.
Thanks.
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.